There is a miracle in the life of Jesus that almost nobody talks about. Jesus needed a small amount of money, a very small amount. Instead of doing what literally anyone else in his position would have done, he chose something stranger, the slowest, most roundabout way possible to get it. He sent a fisherman back into a lake, told him to throw a hook into the water, catch the first fish that bit, open its mouth, pull out a coin inside a fish, on command. Why not something simpler? The moment you actually stop to look at it, it stops making sense. Not because it's unbelievable. It's hard to shrug off, precisely because it makes no sense as a shortcut. And by the end of this video, you'll see it was never meant to be one. It stops making sense because it is unnecessarily complicated. Say it out loud, and it sounds almost absurd. A coin, hidden inside a fish, in the exact amount needed, appearing on command, in front of witnesses who had no reason to make this up. If you read that quickly, it sounds like a magic trick, a campfire story, the kind of miracle you skim past on your way to the ones that feel more important, more dramatic, more worthy of a sermon. Water into wine, Lazarus walking out of a tomb, a storm going silent with one sentence. Those miracles announce themselves. This one hides. It is tucked into 4 short verses near the end of Matthew chapter 17, sandwiched between a mountain where Jesus glows like the sun and a conversation about who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. It is easy to miss. It is easy to treat as filler. But here is the question nobody asks, the question that unravels everything once you actually sit with it. Why would Jesus, the most economical teacher in human history, a man who fed 5,000 people with a snack and picked up every leftover crumb, choose the most inefficient, theatrical, unnecessary method imaginable to pay a small tax bill? There were easier ways. There were obvious ways, and he skipped every single one of them on purpose. Think about the options actually available to him in that moment. Judas Iscariot was carrying the group's money bag. It is mentioned later in the Gospel of John, so we know for a fact that the disciples had a shared treasury, a common fund for exactly this kind of expense. Jesus could have simply said, "Judas, pay it," and the story would have ended in one sentence. Or he could have done what every rabbi in Israel did without controversy, openly claim an exemption, argue his case, and let it go unpaid, the way plenty of religious teachers actually did. Or, since he is the Son of God walking around performing miracles daily, he could have just multiplied a coin in his own open hand the way he multiplied bread. No lake, no hook, no fish, no waiting. Go slower through that same list for a second, because 2 more options never even made the cut. Plenty of teachers in that era simply let the bill go unpaid year after year and faced no real consequence for it, since enforcement was informal and inconsistent at best. And it was common practice, when someone genuinely couldn't cover the amount on the spot, to ask the collector for a short extension, a few days' grace to gather the coins from elsewhere. Peter could have just asked. Any one of these would have solved the problem in under a minute, with 0 fanfare and 0 risk of anyone thinking he was showing off. Jesus rules out every single one of them without a word of explanation, and instead sends his most impulsive, most unpredictable disciple out onto open water to fish for spare change. If you were staging this scene for maximum simplicity, you would never write it this way. A writer inventing a legend to impress people doesn't usually reach for the most roundabout, hardest to verify method available. They reach for the version that sounds cleanest in the retelling. This version is the opposite of clean. It's specific, slightly inconvenient, and strange enough that it raises more questions than it answers, which is exactly the clue that nobody was staging it for simplicity. Someone was staging it for meaning. Instead, he sends Peter fishing. That is not efficiency. That is not the shortest path from problem to solution. This isn't Jesus solving a problem. This is Jesus staging a demonstration, and he's the only one in the room who already knows the ending, already had every answer memorized before Peter finished asking the question. So hold that thought, because we are going to come back to it. Something enormous is hiding underneath this small miracle, and once you see it, you will never read this passage as a footnote again. By the time we reach the end of this video, you are going to understand why this strange little story about a fish and a coin might actually be one of the clearest snapshots of the entire gospel packed into 4 verses. And more than that, you are going to see yourself standing exactly where Peter stood, holding a debt you cannot pay, about to be handed something you did not earn. Before we even get to the theology, there's something worth noticing about the setting itself. This conversation happens in Capernaum, a small fishing town on the edge of the Sea of Galilee, the kind of place where nets dry on the shore every morning, and everybody's income depends on what the water gives up that day. Peter wasn't a wealthy man. He wasn't carrying spare silver in his cloak in case a tax collector showed up unannounced. Fishermen in first-century Galilee lived close to the margin, paying rent on boats, splitting profits with partners, already carrying a Roman tax burden on top of everything else. When the collectors approached him that afternoon, there's a real chance Peter didn't actually have 4 drachmas sitting around to hand over on the spot. That detail rarely gets mentioned, but it matters, because it means this miracle isn't just theologically loaded, it's practically necessary. Jesus isn't performing a party trick to make a point. He's meeting an actual physical financial need for a man who likely couldn't have solved it himself, even if he'd wanted to. Let's start with what this tax actually was, because almost nobody explains it properly, and the details matter more than you think. The men who approached Peter in the town of Capernaum were tax collectors, but not the kind you are probably picturing. They were not Roman officials squeezing occupied territory for imperial revenue. This particular tax had nothing to do with Rome at all. It was a religious tax, paid by Jewish men to fund the temple in Jerusalem, and its roots go back over 1,000 years before this conversation ever happened, all the way to the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 30, God gives Moses a strange instruction during a census. Every man 20 years old and older was required to give a half shekel, no more and no less, rich or poor, as what the text calls atonement money or a ransom for his life, so that no plague would come upon the people when they were counted. This was not a fine. It was not a fee for services rendered. It was tied from its very first mention to the idea of ransom, of paying a price to cover a life. By the time we reach the era of Jesus, this half shekel had evolved into an annual temple tax, collected every year to maintain the sacrifices, the priesthood, and the upkeep of the temple itself. The specific amount required was a didrachma, a Greek silver coin worth exactly 2 drachmas, which corresponded to the half shekel the law demanded. And because it was almost impossible for a single person to hand over exactly half a coin, most people paid in pairs. 2 men would combine their contributions and pay with a single 4 drachma coin called a stater, which is precisely the coin Jesus tells Peter he will find inside the fish's mouth. 1 coin. Enough for exactly 2 people's temple tax, not 1, 2. And it's worth pausing here to clear up a confusion a lot of people carry without realizing it. This was not the tax Rome is famous for demanding, the one that shows up in the story of the census in Bethlehem, or the one Jesus later addresses with his famous line about giving to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. That was a civil tribute, called a kensos, paid to a foreign occupying government, deeply resented by many Jews, precisely because it symbolized subjugation to a pagan empire. This temple tax is a completely different animal. It's internal. It's religious. It's something devout Jewish men paid willingly, even proudly, as an act of devotion to their own God and their own place of worship, not as tribute to a conqueror. Nobody was rolling their eyes about this one. It was closer to what you might think of today as a heartfelt annual offering than a resented government bill. That distinction matters, because it tells us Jesus isn't dodging a hostile foreign tax here. He's making a claim about his relationship to his own Father's house. Keep that number in your mind. It is going to matter enormously in about 2 minutes. Not everyone in first-century Judea agreed on who exactly owed this tax. There's evidence that some groups, including certain priestly circles, and at least one Jewish sect known for separating themselves from mainstream religious life, argued that this annual payment shouldn't be mandatory at all, that it was a later addition rather than a strict command. So this wasn't some uncontested, universally settled bill. There was already a live debate simmering in Jewish religious circles about who was actually obligated to pay it, which makes Jesus' answer even sharper. He doesn't join the existing debate about whether the law technically requires it of ordinary worshippers. He sidesteps it entirely by making a claim no one else in that debate could make. Not, I disagree with the requirement, but I'm the son of the house this requirement funds. So when the tax collectors approach Peter and ask almost casually, does your teacher not pay the temple tax? They are not being hostile. This was a routine, expected question, asked every single year to every eligible Jewish man in every town. Peter, without thinking twice, answers yes. Of course Jesus pays it. Why wouldn't he? He's a devout Jewish teacher who honors the law. It's an automatic answer, the kind you give without even glancing up from what you're doing. But then Peter walks into the house, and before he can even open his mouth to mention the conversation, Jesus speaks first. And this is where the entire passage flips on its head. Jesus asks Peter a question that sounds almost like a riddle. What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own sons or from others? Peter answers exactly the way anyone would answer. From others. Obviously, no king taxes his own household. No king sends a bill to his own children for the privilege of living in the palace he built for them. Taxes flow from the ruler to the outsiders, the subjects, the people who are not part of the royal family. The sons of the king live in the house tax-free, because the house belongs to them by relationship, not by payment. And then Jesus says the sentence that turns this entire story from a mildly interesting anecdote into a theological earthquake. Then the sons are free. There's a small detail in the original Greek here that gets completely lost in translation, and once you see it, the whole exchange sharpens into focus. When Jesus asks whether kings collect tax from their own sons or from others, the word for sons is huioi, meaning children by direct relationship, by birth, by family. The word for others is allotrioi, which literally means foreigners, strangers, people who don't belong to the household at all. Jesus isn't just asking a generic question about who pays taxes. He's drawing the sharpest possible line between two categories of people, those who belong by relationship and those who are outsiders paying to access something that was never theirs to begin with. And by getting Peter to answer his own question, Jesus lets Peter draw the conclusion himself out loud without ever being told directly. Sons don't pay to live in their own father's house. Strangers do. 4 words. That's it. But those 4 words are doing an enormous amount of work, because Jesus has just quietly, almost casually, identified himself as the son of the God to whom this temple belongs. If the temple tax exists to fund and maintain God's house, and Jesus is not a subject of that house, but the son of the one who owns it, then by the very logic Peter himself just agreed to, Jesus owes nothing. He is not others. He is not an outsider paying dues to access something that isn't his. It is his. It was always his. The temple this tax pays for is, in the deepest possible sense, his Father's house, and he is not a guest inside it. This is the same claim in a quieter key that Jesus made as a 12-year-old boy in that very temple, when his worried parents finally found him and he answered, almost surprised they even needed to ask, that of course he was in his Father's house. It is the same claim John's Gospel makes explicit when it describes Jesus as the one through whom everything, including that temple and everyone standing in it, was made. The sons are free. And Jesus has just told Peter, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, in the middle of a completely unremarkable tax conversation, that he is the son. Hold on to that phrase for a moment. The sons are free. Not, the sons get a discount. Not, the sons pay less. Free. Completely, categorically free. There's a question worth sitting with here. One the story is about to answer without ever spelling it out directly. If Jesus is the son who is free, what does that make everyone who follows him? This same idea of sons who no longer live under the weight of an unpayable bill shows up again in letters written by Paul just a few decades after this event, where he describes believers as having been adopted, no longer relating to God as servants nervously trying to earn their place, but as children who already belong, already accepted, already home. Peter, standing on that shore with an empty net and an unpaid tax, is about to become a living illustration of exactly that shift, from someone who has to produce what he owes to someone who receives what he could never have produced. Picture it in more familiar terms for a second. Imagine a king who builds a palace, and inside that palace, his own children grow up, eat at his table, and sleep under his roof without ever once being handed an invoice. Now imagine that same king opens part of his estate to the public, and every visitor who walks through has to pay an entrance fee to help maintain the grounds. Nobody would ever expect the king's own son to buy a ticket to visit his own childhood bedroom. The son isn't a customer. He isn't a guest. He's family. and the whole property exists, partly because of him, not despite him. That's the exact logic Jesus is applying to himself and the temple. The temple was built to house the presence and worship of God. Jesus is not a visitor to that presence. He is not a stranger accessing something foreign to him. In the language the gospel writers use elsewhere, he is one with the Father, and the house belongs to him. In a way, it belongs to no one else standing in that courtyard collecting coins. Now, here is where the story could have simply ended, with Jesus calmly declaring his exemption and walking away untaxed and unbothered, technically correct and legally justified. That would have been a fine ending. It would have made a decent point about identity and authority. But Jesus does not stop there. And this is the turn that separates this passage from a clever riddle and turns it into a preview of the entire gospel. He says, "But so that we may not give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook." He pays anyway, voluntarily, not because he owes it, not because the law can compel him. He has just spent 30 seconds establishing, with airtight logic, that he owes absolutely nothing. No rent, no fee, no obligation of any kind. And immediately afterward, he chooses to pay in full, out of his own free exemption, for a bill he was never obligated to cover in the first place. Sit with that contrast for a second, because it is the whole engine of this story. A person who is exempt and pays anyway is not the same as a person who simply pays what they owe. One is obligation, the other is gift. Jesus is not settling a bill. He is making a choice that nobody could force him into, out of a freedom that nobody else in that conversation possessed. And notice the reason he gives. Not fear, not legal risk. He says it plainly, so that we do not cause offense, so that we do not become a stumbling block to people who would misunderstand and be scandalized if the Son of God appeared to disregard the very house of God. The Greek word behind that idea, skandalizō, is where we get our word, scandal. Jesus willingly steps down from a position of total legal freedom into a position of voluntary payment, specifically to avoid creating unnecessary offense for people who could not yet understand who he really was. He absorbs a cost he does not owe to protect people from a misunderstanding they cannot yet grasp. Keep that instinct in mind, because it's about to show up again in a much bigger way. Think about how easily this could have gone wrong if Jesus had simply refused to pay. Word travels fast in a small town. If the traveling teacher from Nazareth suddenly announced he was exempt from funding the temple, most people wouldn't have heard careful theology about sonship and divine identity. They would have heard that man refuses to support God's house, and the whole message of who Jesus was would have been buried under a scandal about disrespecting sacred institutions before anyone had the chance to understand the deeper claim underneath it. So Jesus does something remarkably wise. He protects the message by paying a bill he technically didn't owe, choosing a smaller temporary cost to prevent a much larger, permanent misunderstanding. That's not weakness. That's restraint used in service of love, the same instinct that will later lead him to wash feet instead of demanding to be served, and to walk toward a cross instead of calling down the armies of heaven he clearly could have summoned. So now the coin has to appear from somewhere, and this is finally where the fish shows up. Jesus tells Peter to go to the sea, cast a line, and take the very first fish that bites. Inside its mouth, Peter will find a stater, and he is instructed to give it to the tax collectors, for me and for you. Not for me and for you. Remember that number from earlier? A stater is worth exactly 4 drachmas, precisely enough to cover 2 people's half-shekel tax. 1 coin, 2 debts. Jesus' tax and Peter's tax paid from a single source, provided in a single moment, covering 2 people who did not earn it and did not produce it themselves. This is not a minor detail. This is the entire theological center of the story hiding in plain sight inside a fish's mouth. Jesus, who owes nothing, provides the exact amount required to cover both his own tax and Peter's. Peter did not need to reach into his own pocket. Peter did not need to sell anything, borrow anything, or scrape together spare coins from the group's treasury. He simply had to go fishing, obey a strange and specific instruction, open the mouth of the very first fish he caught, and receive something he had done absolutely nothing to earn. Peter's job was never to produce the payment. Peter's job was to trust the instruction and receive what was already provided before he ever cast the hook. Here's a question worth pausing on. Why a coin inside a fish specifically? This is where people love to speculate wildly. And honestly, the text itself does not spell out a mechanism, and that's worth being honest about. We are not told how the coin got there, and any confident explanation of the how is guesswork dressed up as insight. What the text does make clear is the timing and the source. Jesus knows precisely which fish, precisely what it's carrying, and precisely how much is needed before Peter's hook ever touches the water. That is the actual claim being made here, not a magic trick for its own sake, but total knowledge and total provision arriving before the need was even acted on. This is exactly why the method matters so much. If Jesus had simply pulled a coin from a pocket or told Judas to hand it over from the treasury, none of this would be visible. The lesson would stay hidden inside an ordinary transaction. But by routing the provision through a fish, through something completely outside Peter's control, outside his effort, outside his own resources, Jesus makes the point impossible to miss. The provision did not come from Peter's own hands. It came to him, sufficient before he asked, precise down to the coin, covering more than his own share without him lifting a finger. Let's take the elevator up one more floor, because this coin is not just about a temple tax. It's connected to something much bigger, and the Bible actually draws that connection explicitly if you know where to look. Remember the half shekel back in Exodus 30? Let's slow down on that passage for a moment, because the details are stranger and more pointed than most people realize. God tells Moses that whenever the people are counted in a census, every man must pay this half shekel, that there be no plague among them when you number them. In the ancient world, a census wasn't just bureaucratic paperwork. Counting people in that context carried the weight of exposure, of standing fully visible before God with nowhere to hide, and the text treats that exposure as dangerous unless it's covered by a payment. The half shekel wasn't buying God's favor like a bribe. It was described explicitly as atonement money, a ransom for each individual life, a small price standing in for something much larger that the person could never actually pay on their own to make themselves right before a holy God. Every single year, faithful Jewish men were unknowingly rehearsing this idea, generation after generation, coin after coin, without necessarily realizing they were participating in a shadow of something still to come. That word, ransom, is not a throwaway word. It's the same concept that reappears just 3 chapters after our fish story in Matthew chapter 20, when Jesus describes his entire mission in a single sentence, that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. The Greek word there is lutron, the payment that buys someone's release, the cost of setting a captive free when they have no way to free themselves. And that same idea surfaces again later, at the last meal Jesus shares with his disciples before the cross, when he lifts a cup and describes his own blood as being poured out for many, language that echoes this exact ransom idea one final time, right before it actually happens. This is actually part of a much older pattern running through the entire Bible, and once you notice it here, you start seeing it everywhere. Provision, again and again, tends to arrive before the need is even fully acted on, not after a person has proven they deserve it. In the wilderness, generations earlier, an entire nation woke up every single morning to bread already lying on the ground outside their tents. Food they hadn't planted, harvested, or earned, provided fresh before hunger even had the chance to set in for the day. A prophet on the run, hiding by a hidden stream, is fed twice a day by ravens who bring him bread and meat without him lifting a finger to hunt or forage for it himself. Water bursts out of solid rock in the middle of a desert for a crowd of people who, if we're honest, had spent the previous chapter complaining bitterly about their leadership. The pattern isn't subtle once you're looking for it. God's provision consistently shows up ahead of human effort, not as a reward for it. The stater in the fish's mouth is one more entry in that same long list, just told in a smaller, quieter key. Do you see the pattern forming? A tax rooted in the idea of ransom money, a coin that pays for 2 people instead of 1, a son who is exempt but pays voluntarily anyway, and a mission statement delivered by that same son a short time later, describing his entire purpose as giving his own life as a ransom for many. The temple tax story is not a random errand. It's a preview running in miniature, months before the real thing plays out on a cross, using a fish and a coin instead of nails and wood, so that the disciples could glimpse the shape of the gospel long before they ever had to watch it happen in full. Jesus, who owed nothing, pays for two. Later, Jesus, who owed nothing, dies for many. The stater in the fish's mouth is the gospel in a single coin. Now, at this point, I know exactly what some of you are thinking, because it's the same question I asked myself the first time someone walked me through this. Is this actually in the text, or are we the ones putting it there? Is this really a deliberate preview of the cross? Or is that just enthusiastic pattern matching, the kind of thing where, if you look hard enough at anything, you can force a connection that was never actually intended? That's a completely fair question, and honestly, it's a healthy instinct to have. Not every detail in Scripture is secretly loaded with hidden meaning, and turning every small story into an elaborate code can actually distract from what the text is plainly saying. So let's be careful here instead of dramatic. Here's why this particular connection holds up, rather than collapsing under scrutiny. It's worth saying plainly, skepticism isn't the enemy here. Some of the most careless teaching about Scripture comes from people who never ask this question at all, who see a shiny connection and run with it without checking whether the text actually supports the weight being placed on it. Asking, is this real or is this reaching, is exactly the instinct that keeps Bible teaching honest, instead of turning it into speculation dressed up as insight. So let's actually answer it, instead of brushing past it. It's not built on a stretch or a coincidence. It's built on the actual vocabulary and structure the text gives us. Exodus itself explicitly labels the half shekel as ransom money, using language of covering and atonement, not just describing it as a generic administrative fee. Matthew, writing this gospel, was clearly aware of that Old Testament background, since the temple tax he describes is that exact half shekel requirement carried forward into his own era. And Matthew is also the one who records Jesus' own explanation of his mission using the word ransom just a short distance later in the very same book. The connections are not imported from outside the text by an overeager reader centuries later. They're sitting right there in the vocabulary Matthew himself chose to preserve. There's a second objection worth addressing too, one that's less about symbolism and more about the miracle itself. Some viewers will naturally wonder, isn't this just a nature miracle, an interesting but disconnected display of power, the kind of story better suited to demonstrating that Jesus can control fish than to teaching anything about ransom or salvation? That's a fair instinct, because Scripture does contain miracles that primarily showcase power and authority, without necessarily carrying this much theological freight attached. But this passage doesn't read like an isolated power display, because Jesus himself frames it, in his own words, around the question of sonship and payment before the fish is even mentioned. The miracle isn't the point of the story, it's the delivery mechanism for the point. If Jesus had wanted to simply prove he could control nature, there were countless simpler and more dramatic ways to do it. The specific, deliberate combination of an exemption claim, a voluntary payment, a coin worth exactly double the required amount, and the phrase, "for me and for you," tells us this was never primarily a demonstration of power. It's a demonstration of provision, wrapped inside a small, almost playful display of power, to make sure nobody could miss where the coin actually came from. That doesn't mean every single detail carries hidden symbolism. It doesn't mean we should assume the specific fish, or the specific lake, or the specific hook are loaded with secret significance beyond what's written. Scripture doesn't need us to invent extra meaning to be powerful. It's already doing plenty of work with what it actually says. But the core shape of this story, an exempt son voluntarily paying a ransom-rooted debt so that another person doesn't have to, sitting inside a gospel that later defines Jesus' whole mission using that exact ransom language, is not an accident. It's not overreading. It's simply reading the text closely enough to notice what was already there. So we can hold both things at once. We can be careful readers who don't manufacture meaning that isn't present. And we can still recognize, honestly and without exaggeration, that this passage is doing exactly what it looks like it's doing, showing us, in a small and almost playful way, the shape of a much larger rescue. Time to bring this all the way home, because a story like this isn't just meant to be understood. It's meant to be felt, and more than that, it's meant to be lived. Go back to the very beginning of this video, back to that opening question. Why a fish? Out of every method available to Jesus, why did the provision have to come from underneath the water, from a place Peter couldn't see into, couldn't control, and couldn't reach without obedience? I think the answer is simpler and more personal than any theological technicality. Peter was a fisherman. Fishing was his old life, his old identity, his old way of surviving before he ever left his nets to follow Jesus. And here, in this quiet, easily overlooked moment, Jesus sends him fishing one more time, except this time, the catch isn't dinner and it isn't income. It's provision for a debt Peter could never have paid on his own. Consider, too, which disciple this happens to. Not John, the one who leans in close at the Last Supper. Not the quiet, steady presence in the background. It's Peter, the same disciple who just a few chapters earlier in this same gospel climbed out of a boat to walk on water toward Jesus and immediately started sinking the moment he looked at the waves instead of at him. The same Peter who, a little further down the road, will insist so confidently that he would never abandon Jesus, and then deny even knowing him 3 separate times in a single night. Jesus doesn't send the most spiritually put-together disciple fishing for provision. He sends the one who is impulsive, inconsistent, prone to over-promising and under-delivering, the one who needs to be rescued from open water more than once in these Gospels. If there was ever a disciple who needed to learn that provision doesn't depend on his own performance, it's this one. That is not a small detail. That is the whole story, wearing a different costume and pointed directly at you. Because here's the truth this passage is quietly asking you to face. You are Peter. You have a debt. Maybe it doesn't look like a temple tax. Maybe it looks like shame you've been carrying so long you've stopped noticing the weight of it. Maybe it looks like guilt over something you did, or something you didn't do, sitting untouched in the back of your mind for years. Maybe it's the quiet, exhausting feeling that you have to earn your way into being loved, into being accepted, into being enough. And no matter how hard you work, the number never quite reaches 0. That's a debt. And like Peter standing on the shore, you cannot produce the payment yourself. Not through effort, not through good behavior, not through trying harder next time. Let me make this more specific because debt can sound abstract until you actually name what it looks like in an ordinary week. Maybe it's the version of you that replays a mistake from 10 years ago at 2 in the morning, still negotiating with a memory that refuses to close the account. Maybe it's the version of you that measures your worth by your output, convinced that if you ever stop producing, stop achieving, stop proving yourself useful, the people around you will finally see how little you actually have to offer. Maybe it's a relationship where you keep quietly, exhaustingly trying to be good enough to deserve to be loved, as if love were a wage you had to earn one shift at a time instead of something freely given. Maybe it's a habit or an addiction you've tried to out-discipline for years, promising yourself that this time, this attempt, this new plan, will finally pay down what you owe. Every one of these is the same posture Peter would have been in if Jesus had simply told him, "Go earn 4 drachmas however you can," standing on a shore with empty hands, staring at a debt with no realistic way to close the gap. But the story doesn't end with Peter standing there empty-handed. It ends with a fish already carrying exactly what he needed, provided before he ever cast the line, sufficient not only for himself, but for someone standing beside him too. The provision came first, the obedience simply received it. Think back for a moment to every other detail we've walked through, and watch how it all lands on this one image. The coin worth exactly double what Jesus owed. The word free applied to sons, not strangers. The ransom language borrowed from a census 1,000 years earlier. The careful choice to pay anyway, out of love rather than obligation. All of it converges here, in an ordinary fisherman's hand, holding a fish he didn't choose, that carried a coin he didn't earn, sized precisely for a debt he couldn't have paid. Nothing in the story is wasted. Nothing is decorative. Every detail we spent the last several minutes unpacking exists to build toward this exact moment. Notice too what Peter's obedience actually looked like, because it's almost comically small. He wasn't asked to dive to the bottom of the lake and search every fish in the Sea of Galilee. He wasn't asked to negotiate, to strategize, to work out some clever financial plan. He was asked to do the one thing his hands already knew, cast a line, and simply open his palm to receive what was sitting there waiting for him. That is what faith looks like in this story. Not frantic effort to manufacture your own rescue, but simple, almost embarrassingly ordinary obedience that puts you in a position to receive something you could never have produced yourself. Peter never had to manufacture the coin himself. It was already swimming toward him before he ever tied the hook. His only job was to show up and open his hand. That's the invitation sitting underneath this entire strange little miracle. Stop trying to dive to the bottom of the sea yourself, searching for a coin you were never meant to find on your own. Stop treating your worth, your forgiveness, your peace as something you have to manufacture through sheer effort before you're allowed to have it. The ransom has already been provided. It was provided before you knew you needed it, by someone who owed nothing and paid anyway, specifically so that you wouldn't have to. Here's the detail I don't want you to miss on your way out of this video, because it's easy to hear all of this and still quietly file yourself under not included. Remember the exact amount of that coin, not 2 drachmas, 4, not enough for one person, enough for 2. Jesus didn't just secure his own freedom and leave Peter to figure out his own arrangement. The very first thing he does with his freedom is extend it to someone standing right next to him. That is not incidental to the story, it is the story. Whatever ransom Jesus paid, he did not pay it only for himself, and he did not pay it only for people who already had their theology figured out. He paid it for someone who, in the chapters just before this one, had already doubted him on the water and would go on, just a little further into the gospel, to deny even knowing him 3 times before a rooster finished crowing. If the coin covers Peter, on his best days and his worst ones, it covers you too. All you're being asked to do is exactly what Peter was asked to do. Not to earn it, not to dive for it, not to prove yourself worthy of it first. Just go to the water, cast the line, open your hands, and receive what was given long before you ever thought to ask for it. If this is the first time you've really looked closely at this story, I hope it stops being a footnote in your reading of the Gospels and starts being something you come back to, the way you'd come back to a coin you found in the strangest possible place, at exactly the moment you needed it most. A didrachma tax, a stater in a fish, a son who was free and paid anyway, a ransom that covers more than one person. That's not 4 disconnected facts to memorize, the kind of trivia you'd forget by next week. That's one story told in miniature about the entire reason Jesus came at all. Small enough to fit inside a fish's mouth and big enough to explain a cross. If this helped you see something you'd never noticed before, do 3 things for me. Subscribe to Bible Talk Simplified because we do this every week, taking small, overlooked passages that most people scroll straight past and slowing down until they open up into something you'll actually remember. Leave a comment telling me what part of this hit you the hardest, whether it was the ransom connection, the for me and for you, the image of a fisherman opening a fish's mouth and finding exactly what he needed, or something else entirely that I didn't even mention. I read these, and I want to know which piece of this landed for you. And if you know someone who's been quietly, exhaustingly trying to earn their way to peace, send them this video today. Not as a lecture, just as a reminder that the debt they've been carrying alone might already be paid in full. Wherever you're watching this from, whatever you're carrying into today, whatever quiet math you've been doing in your head trying to figure out if you've done enough, been enough, fixed enough to finally deserve some rest, I hope you walk away from this video a little lighter than you came in. Not because the weight was never real, it was, and it is, but because you were never meant to carry it alone, and you were never meant to pay it by yourself. Somebody already went fishing for you. Go in peace, and I'll see you in the next one.